The signs of decline are all around us. They are increasingly unavoidable, and there's this real strong sense that things just cannot go on as they are. And this is not just a feeling, it's actually supported by a vast array of evidence. Evidence that suggests that one way or another, a generational course correction is coming. In this video, I'm going to provide my opinion on what's happened, what's happening, why, and what I think we should do about it all. Hi, my name is Tom, and this is my channel Integral Views. My core argument is that the decline that we're currently seeing is as a result of a post-World War II global liberal elite consensus worldview. This involves the liberalisation or globalisation of capital flows, trade flows and migration flows around the world, and it arose as a response to the horrors of World War II. This globalist liberal worldview has delivered relative peace by historical standards, but it has some very major and very consequential blind spots that I'll go through in this video. The globalist liberal worldview has served its purpose, it's done its time. And as with many ideologies or worldviews that have come and gone throughout human history, it's time for it to be replaced with something better and more aligned with what we need in the modern world. But before we get a better understanding of this globalist liberal consensus worldview and the consequences that it has delivered, we first need to understand the context within which it emerged. What came before it? Well, what came before it was really this in-group preference worldview. And within this in-group preference worldview, obviously you have an in-group and you have an out-group. There are of course many different forms of in-group preference, tribalism and feudalism, etc. But then eventually it manifested as nation states, and those nation states were clearly distinguished by the borders and the people within those borders. A definable group of people with common ancestors, common culture, common frames of reference, common language. This national sense of identity or belonging as us as a people developed over hundreds and in some cases thousands of years of tribal infighting, feudalism, struggle, etc. And this manifests as a shared national story consisting of shared language, meaning, historical references, humour, identity and sense of belonging that's passed down over generations. And this is often represented by flags, national anthems and of course definable borders. And within this context, the nation state makes perfect sense because you have voting and you have a sense of belonging and culture and language and meaning that is all associated with that group, with the borders that protect that group. And that group is then of course treated preferentially. But this is not just a recent construct, it's not just a human invention in recent years or decades. This is a very deep element within human psychology and just on life on planet Earth in general. So other examples, birds who nest and feed their chicks, right? And then also ants with colonies, etc., all working together. Now this in-group preference worldview is embedded within human psychology and you can read about it in developmental psychology, but it has a few different aspects. It can manifest in pathological forms and in holistic forms. And wars throughout history, including the Great War and also the Second World War, were examples of it manifesting pathologically. So what was happening was that there was a defined in-group with all these different nations around the world, and then they were preferentially treating themselves and trying to get what they can. But the really pathological element of it was that it was demonizing the outgroup. So it was demonizing and dehumanizing the outgroup. So there's these two elements to this in-group preference worldview. There is protection, there is belonging, there is everything you could associate with being in a family, like one of those chicks in the nest that's being preferentially treated by the birds, the parent birds, etc. Right? So there's this holistic version, this positive version, but there's also this negative version or pathological version. And of course, in those great wars, in the Great War and then the Second World War, what we saw was the pathological version really manifesting. And so coming out of the Second World War, that entire ideology was demonized and seen as incredibly harmful. Essentially, both the positive and negative elements were thrown out. It was like throwing the baby out with the bathwater in order to never repeat what happened during those two major wars. And so our elites, our leaders, got together and they formed all of these different global institutions like the United Nations, World Health Organization, World Trade Organization, the ICC, the ICJ, the list goes on and on, the IMF, the World Bank. Okay, so the list goes on and on. And we took actions such as abolishing exchange rate controls and general moves toward liberalisation of trade and capital flows and migration. The idea was that all of these things can flow around the world, and as a result, we will not have this preferential treatment and then this fighting between these different nations. If we all are together and aligned, and it's all one big slop, one big slop of people around the world, then there'll be no reason for these wars to occur. And so this general globalist liberal mentality supplanted this previous nationalistic or in-group preference worldview that was in its place. Some very recent examples of British politicians expressing this worldview quite clearly. Keir Starmer, when he says, "Britain built for all." Notice how he doesn't say for British citizens, for British people. He's actually saying for all, for everybody. So that's a globalist worldview. And then Wes Streeting, our former health secretary, who was demonising nationalism when he departed that role. But of course, when you throw out that in-group preference worldview, you throw out all of the holistic versions as well. Sometimes with these deep and complex topics, I think it's helpful to boil it down into images in the mind or analogies. So if you think of a house, and that is a home for a family lives there and they have an in-group preference. They have this sense of belonging together. They all belong there and they preferentially treat each other relative to people who are not in that family outside of that house. That house is there for them. They own it, it's theirs, they have control of it, they lock the doors, etc. in order to ensure their protection and security. So if you imagine that the house is the nation state and the people inside are the citizens, that's the analogy I'm trying to paint. But of course that house exists within a community of other houses. In other words, there is a community of nation states. That's the world, right? The problem, of course, is that in that neighbourhood or community of houses with families, there is often conflict with regard to what benefits one house or what one house wants relative to another, what one family wants relative to another family. And so conflicts arise, wars in other words. And of course, you can have a situation where one house or one family in one house could be ganged up on by multiple families in multiple houses. So of course at the nation state level, that will be one nation that is ganged up on by multiple nations. Another way that this can manifest is you have a large family in a large home or an apartment block maybe in this analogy that would then target a smaller house or smaller family that's less capable to then take advantage of them. And the reason that I really like this analogy is because in human psychology, this in-group preference and this kind of belonging, this sense of us or us as a people, that exists at multiple levels of community. So you've got the family, and then you've got the society within which that family exists, and then you've got the nation, and then of course you've got the whole entire human species. And each one of those groupings is important for different reasons. But within the globalist liberal consensus worldview, the existence of that secure family with their in-group belonging, with ownership potentially of their house, etc., right, who can decide what happens with that house, that is a harmful thing. And the reason is because all of those neighborhood disputes were seen as so bad that we had to abolish the entirety of having families and having homes for those families. Everything then had to be open. And so the doors to the house will be open. It's just a place that people can come and go from. And so the things inside the house weren't owned by the people or the family inside the house. It could be owned by anyone who says you have more right to own that than anybody else. One way of looking at it is that we move from having these family homes owned by the family who make the decisions of what happens with those homes to having foreign-owned houses of multiple occupancies or HMOs. So maybe Britain is just one big HMO. Now what I'm going to do is go through various pieces of evidence that show some of the consequences of this worldview and connect some of these dots, okay? Of course, I can't demonstrate everything. I can't show the impact of various shocks and various things that happen. And I know there are other things that play into this, but this is building a cohesive story because often people will just look at certain economic metrics and they'll just look at migration, but they won't connect the dots across all of it and connect it into this overall ideology. But as I said earlier, there are three main elements within this globalist liberal consensus worldview. There is the liberalisation or globalisation of trade, capital, and people. But there's another one that I want to mention quickly, because there is a huge amount of offshoring of work outside of a certain nation, right? So you see this with global corporations where they move work to lower cost locations so they can earn profit in high cost locations in certain economies, and then they have the work done in lower cost locations. And also the profits can be moved out of the country within which they were earned as well. And this is all part of globalization. A very important element in the consequences of this globalist worldview is the changes with regard to the level of immigration that has occurred. Of course, net migration has been at historic highs recently, but that really hides the true impact of the situation, because we have a lot of people who are leaving Britain as well. And this doesn't just apply to Britain. A lot of this applies to a lot of other countries, although the data I'll use in the charts usually refers to Britain in this video. But a statistic that I think represents the reality much better is the foreign-born percentage within Britain. And that is absolutely at levels that has never been seen before. So people often say, well, this is just a normal course of events. You know, migration is a normal part of life. And yeah, to some extent kind of true, but not true really with regard to what's happening now. This has never happened before. So I created this chart that shows the foreign-born percentage from the year 0 to the year 2025. And what it shows is that even back in the Roman times, we had, around 400 AD, the level of foreign-born population in Britain at the time was 3.5%, something like that. And then with the Norman invasion in 1066, that spiked somewhere around 2% foreign-born percentage. And the reason for that, those low levels, is because moving between countries was not as easy at all. And also it happened over a much longer period of time. But today it's at 20% plus, and the truth is that nobody really knows what the percentage is. And the reason that this is so important is because it takes multiple generations for people to come to a certain place and then truly assimilate into the culture. Because like it or not, in our youth we do absorb the culture within which we are brought up. And many even second generation migrants in Britain now are not brought up in something that could be identifiable as British culture. They're brought up in these different cultures that are, largely foreign. They're foreign cultures. And this really matters, because what is that culture doing? What is the clothing, the language, the meaning, all of those kinds of things? What is that doing? The frames of reference. It is defining a certain group of people. And so when you have all of these different definable groups of people, you might think, oh, everybody can just get along swimmingly and it will be fine. But actually they have different conflicting interests at times and beliefs and things that they think should happen. This is what feudalism was all about. And it's tribalism that we see all around the world. So we've imported that, and we need to face that reality. Next up is the fact that we had what you could refer to as a generational fire sale of public sector and private sector assets, starting in around the late 1970s after Britain had an IMF bailout. These are just some highlights of a very, very long list. But we had British Telecom, British Gas, British Airways, British Airports Authority, British Petroleum, Rolls-Royce, British Steel, regional water companies, regional electricity companies, National Power, Powergen, Scottish Electricity, and then the rest of BT. But basically, we also have major foreign ownership of our national grid. Not to mention also the new net zero energy infrastructure and nuclear power plants that are being built. Yep, majority foreign owned. And of course, this applies in the private sector as well. So a lot of those British brands, Cadbury's is an example, there are many, you name it, everything has been sold off seemingly. It's not just British companies in their entirety or British brands that have been sold off, or even British assets or like gold, etc. Okay, it's not just that that's been sold off. In addition, at the end of 2024, UK incorporated companies quoted on the London Stock Exchange had 2.54 trillion of ordinary shares by market value, 2.54 trillion. The rest of the world beneficial owners held 58.8% of that. And by the way, UK resident individuals only own 11.6%. So UK ownership 11.6%, foreign ownership 58.8%. So we'll often hear about attracting foreign investment and how great it is. But then of course you've got foreign ownership and foreign profits. To demonstrate the magnitude of the change that has occurred, In 1992, the inward foreign direct investment position was around 114 billion. So 1992, 114 billion pounds. But then by 2024, it was 2.13 trillion pounds. And then in the Office for National Statistics annual business survey for 2021, there were 36,700 foreign-owned businesses, and they represented about 1.4% of the total volume of businesses that were surveyed. So only 1.4%, no big deal, right? Foreign-owned businesses. Only 1.4% of the total, 36,000 is fine. No, it's not. Because that 1.4% represented 29% of the gross value added. So in other words, a lot of that relatively small number of businesses that were foreign owned actually were very, very large businesses. And of course, with this trade liberalisation and equalisation of trade rules through the World Trade Organization, we also saw international trade become a much larger part of the economy in Britain. So in 1970, it was 43% of the economy, but now it's 62.5%. Additionally, we've seen a huge loss of jobs in UK manufacturing, down by about 4.2 million jobs, something like that, since the late 1970s. Hopefully you can see the picture that I'm building up here. You had this trade liberalisation, the liberalisation of capital flows, and really globalisation of all of this, and then migration as well. It's all interconnected. But we're reaching an inflection point because none of this works anymore. Our living standards are stagnating and we're seeing the loss of meaning and culture. And really what's happening is we're working harder and harder for foreign profits, so it's just not working anymore. Additionally, we live in this context where technology is developing incredibly quickly. So we have these exponential curves of technological development. So we have artificial intelligence that's developing at a remarkable pace and will definitely be taking a lot of jobs in the very near future. In fact, it's already happening. And I really like the author Ray Dalio, and this is his book, Principles for Dealing with a Changing World Order. It's fantastic. He talks about these small cycles and then larger cycles in terms of economic booms and busts. And he says the last really big bust cycle was, well, you guessed it, around the Second World War. And they happen around every 80 years. We also see fertility rates at absolutely unsustainable levels because, of course, everybody must work all the time for all of those foreign profits, right? Not only foreign, but you get what I'm saying. So the whole system just doesn't function in terms of sustaining a family and having all of this sense of meaning and purpose. It just doesn't work. In Britain, we also have completely unsustainable levels of national debt with very high interest rates, and we have huge inflation to boot. Also, our living standards have not been improving, so GDP per capita has been stagnated since around 2007. But what do we do about all of this? Clearly, there's a very big problem or series of compounding problems, right, at the same time. So what do we do about all of this? Okay, so here's my thesis. Here's what I think. I think that if you look at the in-group preference, which has really been lost, we've seen a degradation in our culture, in our in-group belonging, in our purpose, all of those kinds of things, right? That's what's really been lost. That's the baby that was thrown out with the bathwater when globalisation came in and liberalisation came in. And so we need to reintegrate those holistic versions of it without descending into the pathological versions that we saw in World War II, etc. And often what we'll see is when people identify this large globalist liberal agenda, this issue that has been occurring and is occurring, right, what they'll tend to do is reject it entirely. So reject the entirety of global cooperation in the form of like the World Trade Organization, etc. And you can actually see Donald Trump doing a lot of this in the United States. And that is really, what's best for us, United States first and only, really, and we will take actions for our benefit. But the reality is that if every nation, it might be okay for the United States because, their military and economy, etc., and the number of people, right? That might be all right for a while. But in history, actually what's happened is that when all nations act like that, like a neighborhood, right, where different families are just trying to get what's best for them, then you'll see this certain family or certain nations taking advantage of other nations, larger nations taking advantage of smaller nations, manipulating situations, ganging up, and then you have wars and eventually world wars. And many will actually see history through rose-tinted glasses, looking at the problems that we see today that were very real and very severe, and in fact potentially even existential. Nevertheless, people will often see history through rose-tinted glasses and look back and say, wow, things were all so good then, but they won't look at the really dark side of it, which was definitely the case as well. And then others will totally deny or ignore the existence of the major harms that have been caused by this global liberal agenda as well. Now, I'm not going to be able to go through every single thing that we should do and every policy in great detail in this video, but one thing that I think needs to be reintegrated as a general approach by our leaders and in general is prioritize British citizens. How hard is that to understand? It blows my mind. Our government has this approach of prioritize everybody else, and that makes me a really good person because I'm showing my allegiance and my alignment with this global liberal order. So they deny any harms that have been the consequence of that ideology. Then we need to protect British culture, and that means limiting the number of foreign-born people in the country at any given time. That doesn't mean that you get rid of migration altogether. Of course, we can have talented and great people join the nation and become part of our larger tribe. But if you have unlimited flows, as has been the case recently, right, with this ideology, it doesn't matter, everyone's the same anyway, well, that's just completely delusional. And then you do definitely lose that common sense of belonging and culture over time. Also, we need to wise up to foreign profiteering through foreign investment in infrastructure, even national security kind of critical infrastructure that we have allowed. And it's not just in those previously publicly owned assets, it's in businesses in many different ways. We need to wise up to the fact that actually that kind of investment often is quite predatory when looked at from an international standpoint. And so in a sense, what I'm calling for is this pretty fragile middle way, which is enshrining and ensuring the continuation of culture and people who are identifiable as a group that have priority, that is sort of outlined within governmental policy and prioritization of them as a people, which should just be the norm, but apparently isn't anymore. So it's that, but it's also doing that within a larger global framework that does set trading standards, etc., and have a kind of global cooperation. In order to understand what we're trying to avoid from both different ideologies so that we can integrate them and have something better going forward, let's just consider it for a while. Okay, so in World War II, what was it that was going on from the perspective of the Nazi regime, right? They were demonizing an outgroup. They were believing that they were superior, and then they dehumanized the outgroup, right? So they had their in-group preference. They were demonstrating that in-group preference as us people, right? But then that was kind of aligned with this pathological hatred and demonization and projection of all harm and toxicity onto one specific outgroup that wasn't part of their in-group. And that then justified inhumane treatment of them to an extreme degree. And we saw this actually also in many other parts of the world. It was a horror show. It really was. I think a lot of people aren't truly aware of the depths of the horror of the Second World War. Of course, I know people are to some extent, but you know, I've read stuff that I kind of in a way wish I hadn't. But yeah, no, not good. So just one example. When Japan actually invaded mainland China at the time, they really dehumanized, they didn't see them as equal humans in any way. And it was the same with the Nazis. But basically what happened with Japan was they ran these competitions to see who could kill 100 civilians in China the fastest using ninja swords, beheading them. And so just absolutely horrific inhuman treatment. And why does that occur? Because they're demonized. They're seen as subhuman. I'm better, I'm perfect, and you're terrible just inherently. There's nothing you can do about it. It's just you. And it becomes a source of the hatred to be projected onto those individuals. But it's absolutely possible to have a coherent sense of you as a people and a continuation of your culture with preferential treatment without that kind of dehumanizing, often racist kind of behavior that we've seen throughout history that is the pathological version of that ideology. And so what individuals who inhabit this globalist ideology often do is they collapse down the in-group belonging from, protection and belonging and us as a coherent group, shared meaning, this is us, right? They collapse that down into pathological forms, which I've just spoken about, the dehumanizing forms. So that's what they do. They collapse it both, and they reject it all, and they say, well, what a really good person is someone who believes this globalist ideology. But then they're ignoring the harms that are caused by that globalist ideology. And what's really ironic is that individuals who adhere to that globalist ideology that's very common on the left, but let's face it, also on the right with the Tories, with the Conservatives, etc., Thatcher, etc. Okay, but individuals who adhere to that will often unconsciously be displaying those same in-group behaviors that they're demonizing. So for example, on the left, you'll have this very coherent, this is us, we're on the left, we have our dyed hair and we have these signs and we all believe the same thing, this is us, it's our group. And then that's the bad group, the billionaires and everyone, they're the demons, they're the bad. And so in-group, out-group. And that justifies this hatred and this, this kind of violent actions often. So they're demonstrating actually often quite pathological forms of in-group behavior themselves. But I just want to go through a couple of examples of how this globalist ideology within its systems has really overstepped the mark. So in the United Nations, there is this Agenda 2030, and within it you've got these Sustainable Development Goals. And what it does is it tries to implement, these unbalanced trade arrangements, so that countries that are potentially slightly worse off, they get better trade arrangements, and it tries to implement this equity, this postmodern kind of equity on the output, within these globalist systems. So they're really overstepping the mark. So I think largely a lot of these large global organizations have just grown into these behemoths that they were never intended to be. And just to continue focusing on the United Nations, although I could focus on other organizations as well, another couple of examples within those Sustainable Development Goals that I mentioned was this reduction of remittances. And remittances is payments that individuals who've migrated to a certain country send out to other countries. So let's say someone migrates here from Pakistan and then they want to send money home to their family to support them in Pakistan. That UN 2030 agenda has basically had all UN member states sign up to reducing the cost of those remittance charges, meaning that it's cheaper for them to send money out. And the idea is that then it leads into this global flow of money and people, which is this globalist ideology. We also had the United Nations do this study on replacement migration. I've made videos on a number of these different things, but they were actually talking about, well, we've got this aging population, so yeah, can we just bring in millions and millions of people? Isn't it a little bit coincidental that that's exactly what's happened? It's not a coincidence at all, because it's all part of exactly the same ideology, moving in exactly the same direction through capital, trade and migration flows. In addition to really eroding national culture and a sense of belonging as us as a people at that level of the nation state, basically just getting rid of it entirely, or at least moving in that direction as much as possible, and demonizing anyone who wants to have that as a construct, is the reality that there's an erosion of the democratic process when you have these global organizations that are growing and growing and growing. And so people become less and less able to have a say over very important things about their lives. Another thing I want to point out is that the majority of nations in the world are absolutely operating with in-group preference as we speak all of the time. They're operating like that in the world right now. And so if you're a nation that is built for all and you don't have that sense of us and protection and, this is the priority, we're the preferential group and this culture, etc., then you will be taken advantage of by other nations who are overtly self-interested. Examples, China, Russia, many other countries around the world, the majority. Now, increasingly, both the left and the right of politics have identified this situation and are moving into new positions. We're seeing the complete removal of the establishment parties, but both the left and the right have different views on what we need to do in the direction we need to head in. So the left thinks we just need to go much faster, go light speed, remove borders completely, allow anyone in, and do all of these things. So just move further and further. We just didn't go far enough into the full globalist utopia, just a bit further, and then it will manifest as this perfect, beautiful world because love is all you need, and it'll just be butterflies flying around everywhere, Care Bears jumping, and nice rainbows, and lovely, yeah? And we'll all be singing together. Total delusional nonsense. But then on the right of politics, there is this tendency to view history through rose-tinted glasses and think, oh, let's just turn back the hands of time, maybe 50, maybe 80 years, and everything will be fine because things were just all good back then, but they really weren't just all good back then. So one way or another, we have to move forward, and one way or another, big change is coming, because all of those trend lines, well, they don't just stop, they're going to carry on. And so, yes, something's got to give, something's going to happen. I just hope that we manage to, as I said, like thread that needle between that in-group preference, belonging worldview, so that we do have that coherent sense of us as a people and culture and preferential treatment. But then also we do have these mechanisms that allow cooperation globally, and we don't see, kind of like this reversion collapsing back down into pure self-interest as nations, because that inevitably does end up in conflict. And specifically for Britain, let's say that we entered that world of pure self-interest, everybody for themselves, this is us as a people, etc. Let's say we entered that position. Well, yeah, China's grown a hell of a lot. They are just absolutely dominating. That's the truth. That's what I think. And I think that ultimately they're a huge potential threat, because they're self-interested, overtly so, very clearly. And so what are we going to do? We're just going to have them come along as a big bully nation and take advantage of us? That's why you need these global mechanisms of trade regulation and various other things. It's just when those global mechanisms get completely out of control, in alignment with this really flawed ideology that erodes, the sense of meaning and culture and purpose and belonging as a nation state, that things are just out of balance. So that's my theory, and I hope you found that interesting. I would love to hear your thoughts. I know there's a lot of different elements that play into this, but I'd love to hear your thoughts if you think that we can actually get that maybe, I don't know, idealistic reality where we have got that sense of us as a people, we continue with British culture, etc., but we also have cooperation globally. Is that just naive? Am I just far out there? I don't know. You tell me. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Please like the video if you liked it, and subscribe to my channel if you're not already and you'd like to hear more from me. And lastly, I am working a lot on the members area for my channel. So I've got this members area and I'm starting to put a lot of videos on there. I've made it as cheap as I possibly can. I'm really trying to build a community, and I'm trying to sort of provide, my sort of more direct views and have a lot of conversations in that group. So check it out if you're interested. Okay, thank you so much for watching again. Until next time, cheers.